Recognizing the abrupt, decisive tones of the psychologist in conversation in the inner office, Carl went to the door and knocked sharply. "I beg your pardon, but can you possibly postpone what you are doing, Mr. Trant?" he questioned, quickly as the door opened and he faced the sturdy and energetic form of the red-haired young psychologist, who in 6 months had made himself admittedly the chief consultant in Chicago on criminal cases. "My name is Carl. Henry Howe introduced me to you last week at the club, but I'm not presuming upon that for this interruption. I and my friend need your help badly, Mr. Trant, and immediately. I mean, if we cannot speak with you now, we may be interrupted unpleasantly." Carl had moved as he spoke to hide the girl behind him from the sight of the man in the inner office, who Carl had been seen was a police officer. Trant noted this, and also that Carl had carefully refrained from mentioning the girl's name. "I can postpone this present business, Mr. Carl," the psychologist replied quietly. He closed the door, but reopened it almost instantly. His official visitor had left through the entrance directly into the hall. The two young clients came into the inner room. "This is Mr. Trant, Ethel." Carl spoke to the girl a little nervously as she took a seat. "And Mr. Trant, this is Miss Waldron. I have brought her to tell you of a mysterious man who has been pursuing Howard Axton about the world, and who, since Axton came home to her house 2 weeks ago, has been threatening her." "Axton? Axton, I?" the psychologist repeated, the name which Carl had spoken, as if assured that Trant must recognize it. I, of course, Howard Axton is the son." He frankly admitted his clearing recollection of his comprehension of how the face of the girl had seemed familiar. "Then you," he addressed her directly, "are Miss Waldron of Drexel Boulevard." "Yes, I am that, Miss Waldron, Mr. Trant," the girl replied, flushing red to her lips, but raising her head proudly and meeting his eyes directly. "The stepdaughter, the daughter of the second wife of Mr. Nimrod Axton. It was my mother, Mr. Trant, who was the cause of Miss Anna Axton getting a divorce and the complete custody of her son from Mr. Axton 20 years ago. It was my mother who, just before Mr. Nimrod Axton's death last year, required that in the will the son, the first Miss Axton was then dead, should be cut off absolutely and entirely without a cent, and that Mr. Axton's entire estate be put in trust for her. My mother. So, since you doubtless remember the reopening of all this again 6 months ago when my mother too died, I am now the sole heir and legatee of the Axton properties of upwards of 60 millions. They tell me, yes, I am that, Miss Waldron, Mr. Trant. I recall the accounts, but only vaguely. From the death of Mr. Axton, and later of the second Miss Axton, your mother, Miss Waldron," Trant replied quietly, "though I remember the comment upon the disposition of the estate both times. It was from the pictures published of you and the accompanying comment in the papers only a week or two ago that I recognized you. I mean, of course, the recent comments upon the son, Mr. Howard Axton, whom you have mentioned, who has come home at last to contest the will. You do Miss Waldron an injustice. All the papers have been doing her a great injustice. Mr. Trant," Carl corrected quickly, "Mr. Axton has not come to contest the will." "No?" "No, Miss Waldron has had him come home at her own several times repeated requests, so that she may turn over to him as completely as possible the whole of his father's estate. If you can recall in any detail the provisions of Mr. Axton's will, you will appreciate, I believe, why we have preferred to let the other impression go uncorrected. For the second, Miss Axton so carefully and completely cut off all possibility of any of the property being transferred in any form to the son, that Miss Waldron, when she went to a lawyer to see how she could transfer it to Howard Axton, as soon as she had come into the estate, found that her mother's lawyers had provided against every possibility except that of the heir marrying the disinherited son. So she sent for him, offering to establish him into his estate, even at that cost. You mean that you offered to marry him? Trant questioned the girl directly again. And he has come to gain his estate in that way? Yes, Mr. Trant. But you must be fair to Mr. Axton also, the girl replied. When I first wrote him almost a year ago, he refused point blank to consider such an offer. In spite of my repeated letters, it was not till 6 weeks ago, after a shipwreck in which he lost his friend who had been traveling with him for some years, that he would consent even to come home. Even now, I remain the one urging the marriage. The psychologist looked at the girl keenly and questioningly. I need scarcely say how little urging he would need, entirely apart from the property. Carl flushed. If he were not gentleman enough to appreciate, partly at least, Miss Waldron's position. Her friends, Mr. Trant, have admitted that he appeared at first well enough in every way to permit the possibility of her marrying him if she considers that her duty. But now this mystery has come up about the man who has been following him, the man who appeared again only this morning in Miss Waldron's room and went through her papers. And Mr. Axton cannot account for it. The psychologist helped him. Axton won't tell her or anybody else who the man is or why he follows him. On the contrary, he has opposed in every possible way every inquiry or search made for the man, except such as he chooses to make for himself. Only this morning he made a threat against Miss Waldron if she attempted to summon the police and take the man out of his hands. And it is because I am sure that he will follow us here to prevent her consulting you. When he finds that she has come here, that I ask you to see us at once. Leave the details of his appearance this morning to the last, then, Trant requested abruptly. And tell me where you first heard of this man following Mr. Axton, and how. How, for instance, do you know he was following him? If Mr. Axton is so reticent about the affair, that is one of the strange things about it, Mr. Trant. The girl took from her bosom the bundle of letters she had taken from her room. He used to write to amuse me with him. As you can see here, I told you I wrote Mr. Axton about a year ago to come home, and he refused to consider it. But afterwards he always wrote in reply to my letters, in the half-serious, friendly way you shall see. These 4 letters I brought you are almost entirely taken up with his adventures with the mysterious man. He wrote on typewriter, as you can see. She handed them over, because on his travels he used to correspond regularly for some of the London syndicates. London? Yes, the first Miss Axton took Howard to England with her when he was scarcely 7, immediately after she got her divorce. He grew up there and abroad. This is the first return to America. I have arranged those letters, Mr. Trant, she added, as the psychologist was opening them for examination now, in the order they came. I will read them that way, then, Mr. Trant said, and he glanced over the contents of the first hastily. It was postmarked at Cairo, Egypt, some 10 months before. He then reread more carefully this part of it. But a strange and startling incident has happened since my last letter to you, Miss Waldron, which bothers me considerably. We are, as you will see by the letter paper, at Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo, but could not, after our usual custom, get communicating rooms. It was after midnight, and the million noises of this babbled town had finally died into a hot and breathless stillness. I had been writing letters, and when through, I put out the lights to get rid of their heat, lighted instead the small night lamp I carry with me, and, still partly dressed, threw myself upon the bed. Without, however, any idea of going to sleep before undressing, as I lay there, I heard distinctly soft footsteps come down the corridor on which my room opens and stop, apparently in front of the door. They were not, I judged, the footsteps of a European, for the walker was either barefooted or wore soft sandals. I turned my head towards the door, expecting a knock, but none followed. Neither did the door open. Though I had not yet locked it, I was on the point of rising to see what was